I am delighted to be with all of you. I don't know how the weather is in New York and Brooklyn right now, but here in
Raining.
He might have heard me reading it. He sat over my shoulder, Deborah. It is a little rainy and raw today, but it's the perfect day to, if not curl up with a good book, to be able to talk about a good book, and also the stories and the memories that that help us connect both to one another and to our history, and also those stories we take into our future. So I am delighted today that we have with us Richard Rabinowitz, who is the author of Objects of Love and Regret, a Brooklyn story. I'm actually going to, hold on. I'm delighted to be able to share his book and to certainly share his company in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. Many of you are familiar that our empty nesters, most of our book discussions, if not all this year, are through the auspices of the Jewish Book Council, and which is a wonderful way to connect us to amazing authors on a variety of topics that connect us Jewishly and in our personal stories and our communal stories as well. I am placing in the chat a link to our WHC Mitzvah Mall, which supports both Mitzvah Day and other opportunities for us to support our greater community. I also encourage you to find a local bookseller as well, to purchase the book if you have not already. And I hope that if you haven't already read this morning's book, that you will do so. I'm sure, actually, I know just from my conversation with Richard the other day that your interest will be piqued. You will be inspired to read Objects of Love and Regret, a Brooklyn story. So I will start. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to remind everyone that during our program, if you have questions you would like me to pose to our author, that I invite you to send them directly to me in the chat. We invite you to remain on mute. We'll have a chance a little bit later for people to unmute. But in order to just be able to first of all, to be able to be focused on our conversation, I invite you to send those to me in the chat. I also want to thank the empty nesters, and in particular Ruth Seif and Barbara Sunnies, for their support of this, of our book discussions, our book programs, and in selecting wonderful choices. And I say wonderful. I love having this opportunity to read the books and be in conversation with our authors. And everyone certainly has been a delight. So we encourage you to purchase the book if you have not already. You can even just do that right now through the Mitzvah Mall, or make plans to purchase it over the weekend at a local bookseller. So now on to introducing our author, Richard Rabinowitz. Educated and inspired by a New York City childhood and adolescence, Richard went on to do a BA and PhD at Harvard. Forgoing an academic career, he has spent over half a century creating history museums and exhibitions in every corner of the United States. He has helped plan and design such museums as the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. If you have not been, I know some of you have. We take our confirmation class every year, and certainly that is a jewel certainly in the Jewish community, but in our history as a country, certainly history of New York as well. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, where I was recently, and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, and many exhibitions at the New York Historical Society, including Slavery in New York and Revolution, the Atlantic World Reborn. In the last few years, he has occupied himself mostly at the 42nd Street Library in Manhattan and writing books to explore the history and memories of his hometown. I do know, I know that there are some former Brooklynites here. I'm sure lots of stories could be told and shared, but today we're really going to hear from Richard about his current book, and we'll ask some questions as well. but really about, certainly how we hold on to items, how we let go of items perhaps as well, and what they represent. So I'm so grateful, so happy to be able to welcome you to Washington Hebrew, and I'm going to give you the stage.
Thank you. I love the idea of a mitzvah mall. I've never heard of that, so that's great. I was, when my mom died in November of 2015, and the rabbis just said about letting go. As I was letting go of my mom, in a sense, and delivering the eulogy at our own shul in Brooklyn, I began to think about whether or not it began to sort of worry me that I was speaking these words. My mother was a very sweet person. Everybody loved her. But I knew there was a kind of deeper story there that, in a certain way, like most children, I had not focused so much on my mother, but on her love for me and for my sister. And I began to think, I don't know exactly how much I know the deep story about my mother. So there's a pleasure. I want to ask you, why do we think about studying the biography, looking for the biography, the life history of our parents? There's a whole lot of mysteries. What were they like as children? How did your parents meet each other and get together? And why did they choose each other? What was their life like in those years before you were born? And as a historian, of course, I was interested in what their life was like going through these events that I had studied in history books. And my parents, of course, were witnesses and part of the history. They helped make the history of so many things that historians write about. World War I and the pogroms in Poland and the immigration experience and the restriction on immigration and New York and the United States in the 1920s and 1930s, the Depression and World War II and the post-war years, and the changes that were taking place in the Jewish community over those years, and the experience of my grandparents on both sides, which were very different one from another. So they were witnesses and parts of that history. I often say, if it weren't for Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, my parents would have had a much more difficult, they would probably have been living in this house with my wife and me, because as people who got older, the chance to have an independent life depended on Social Security and Medicare and things like that. So there are a lot of interesting things that I wanted to know about, and I set out to think about that. Now, my parents didn't leave, probably, I don't know how many of your parents have left piles of letters. Historians love documents. We're trained to study do scholarly investigations. I was trained to study 17th and 18th century documents. I learned how to read the calligraphy of old New Englanders and even people in France and Britain. When I was doing research, I didn't have any letters from my parents. They were not letter writing people. They didn't keep a diary. They were not separated during World War II, so they didn't write long letters to each other back and forth. So they wrote their autobiographies, as I say in the book, with pots and pans in the kitchen, with tools in the toolbox to fix leaky faucets and things like that. That's how they wrote their lives. And I've always been interested in people who lived that kind of tactile, who made their lives out of the intelligence in their fingers and in their eyes, in their wit, and not simply by being super literate or extraordinarily good at calculation. So over the years, that's what attracted me to the Tenement Museum project. I've done a project in Seattle on the Chinese salmon butchers who worked in the canneries. I've worked in Orlando on orange grove workers, and in Arizona on people who worked in the cotton fields and in ranching. And I've sat through, done studies sitting in Ogallala, Nebraska at at a cattle auction and try to understand that. And I spent a lot of time working on the history of slavery and how the day-to-day experience of the plantation or of free Black New Yorkers, how their lives were led. So I've always tried to understand, and even now I sometimes go into a restaurant and I try to understand how does the maitre d' and the waitresses and the owners, how do they understand, what are they trying to do, how do they organize themselves, where does the stuff come from, how did they learn these kinds of skills? And it's a subject that I say in the book that nowadays most of us historians focus more on people's preoccupations, on the things we're thinking about, than we do on our occupations, on how we actually living in the world. I love the idea of walking into a room to say, I see an object, a desk, and I wonder, where did this come from? We did an exhibit on the Haitian Revolution at the New York Historical Society, and I knew that the finest mahogany in the world came from the island of Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And we were in Paris. Somebody had to do this research, so we went to Paris. And my wife and partner, Linda, called up the curator of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, part of the Louvre. And she said, so can you tell me whether any of this beautiful Louis Quinze furniture came from mahogany that was harvested in Saint-Domingue in Haiti? And the curator said, we have never asked this question. We have never bothered to ask this question. So for us, trying to understand where this stuff came from, what every object is the product of some of that kind of labor. So that was the kind of thing that I've always been given to thinking about that, to maybe overcompensating for the kind of intellectual training I got as a historian. And then I went down with my sister to clean out my mother's kitchen drawer, and I found this object, this bottle opener in her kitchen drawer. And it was very familiar to me because I remember growing up with this. It's a bottle opener. And when I remembered, not only I remember using it, but I remembered a story that my mother told about buying this when she was about 18. She was coming home from work in the garment factory in the West 30s, taking the subway, getting off the subway on a Friday night on Shabbos. And she had decided to stop off and buy something as a little something, she said, a little something for your bubbe on Friday night on Shabbos. And then she started to tear up and she said, oh, your bubbe, she worked so hard. So that story remained in my mind for about 30 years until I found this thing again. And then I took it home with me, put it on my desk right here. And I looked at the blade and it says LUND space CO, patented November 7, 33, made in USA. So I did what any PhD would do. I Googled LUND space CO, and I discovered that it was made by the Edlund Company in Burlington, Vermont. And they're still in business. They make very elaborate, high quality openers for huge can mixers, all kind of portion control devices, as part of an international conglomerate. But it started out as this little Vermont company. And I got to work, and I just decided I would really test my history chops on this. And I found out within 2 weeks, I knew exactly the name of the French-Canadian man, Adélard Charette, who made this in the factory in the 1930s. And I knew everything. I met his grandson, and I knew the whole technical process. But the thing that really stuck with me was that my mother had been sort of part of this whole history. What was this about? And why had she bought a bottle opener as a present for my bubbe? So these objects, I'm not really interested in the history of bottle openers in and of itself, although the Museum of Modern Art actually put this in an exhibition in 1938. They had an exhibition called Useful Objects Under $5 every year. And they created this exhibition. But I wasn't interested in it so much for that, but rather for the stories that get attached to it. And so I realized that the way to tell the story of my parents and my grandparents was to look for the objects, to sort of frame in, focus in on the objects in their daily lives and how they live their lives that would allow me to sort of evoke scenes and also connect myself and my sister to stories that we had heard. My mother was a great storyteller, almost all of them precisely true. My father was a great storyteller, some of them relatively interesting, all of them interesting, but for some of them, only a few of them true. That was just the difference between them. She was a woman of fact, and he was a comedian, he was a stand-up comic. So his stories were always had a little bit of a kind of vaudeville genealogy behind them. Anyway, so I began to sort of look for these objects over the course of their history together and my grandparents' history. And I went to Poland and to see for myself what the geography, the physicality of this landscape was like was very surprising to me. It's a beautiful countryside now that my mother had grown up in and lived in until she was 12 years old. She was alone with my grandmother for about 6 years. And my grandfather had come to the United States in 1922 and left my grandmother, my mother, and the two younger boys in Poland. And those 6 years together had obviously created an intense bond. And one day my sister and I looked at each other and said, Mom really loved us. But the great love of her life, the great bond of her life wasn't really Richard and Beverly. It really wasn't even Dave Rabinowitz. It was really her mother. They were so intensely close and bound with all the good and sometimes bad things that kind of bond can create. When my grandmother died in 1949, my mother was 32, and it was a devastating loss, disorienting. So that became a way of provoking me to think about the arc of her life, the arc of my father's life, the way in which the two of them related to each other. And I started to do this research on their life experiences. The New York Public Library is amazing. You can, if you want to find out, started thinking, my parents I knew met at this wedding in June of 1933. They said their first date was to go to Radio City Music Hall. And my father remembered that he went to see a movie called Morning Glory with Katharine Hepburn. But when you went to the New York Times archive, the movie didn't open in New York until August 18th. So clearly their memory was, this was a very important event. Radio City was an amazing place. It was just opened recently. It was the first time. It cost $1.25 a ticket. And I tried to figure out how they got there from Brooklyn on the subway and the elevated train on 6th Avenue, which of course now is long gone. And what it felt like to walk into that space and to sit and watch that movie. And the show, the chorus line was called the Roxyettes. They weren't yet called the Rockettes. So I learned a lot of stuff, and I learned a lot about then how did he ask her for a date? Well, the New York Public Library has these great reverse phone books for New York City. So you could find out, if you looked up 502 Alabama Avenue, where my mother was living, right? And you find out who owned in that apartment building, who owned a telephone. Nobody, it turns out, owned a telephone in that building for the whole 1930s, well through World War II. So how did you make a date? So, remembering another story, I remembered that my father told me the story of you called the local candy store. And I went through the phone book and found that there were 18 candy stores within a 4-block radius or something. And they all had telephones. And the reason they had telephones is they were all listed as stationery stores. The stationery that they sold was probably betting slips, because they were all bookies who were providing locals with an opportunity to bet on the ponies at Saratoga or Belmont racetracks. Anyway, all of that became very interesting. How did you ask for a date? What did you do on all of that? And how did you think about your life and creating a life together? They had a very difficult time. Almost all of their lives, they had until they retired in the 1970s. This wasn't, if you look up the standard story of Eastern European Jewish immigrants to the United States, especially to East Coast cities like New York or Boston or Baltimore or Chicago even, you get a narrative that talks about the almost inevitable upward mobility. First generation of peddlers, second generation of shopkeepers, the third generation are professionals, scholars, academics, artists, so on, and doctors and lawyers. And that turns out not to be altogether true. And my parents, and that's the story of my parents of working in small businesses. It's almost never been told. If you know the novels and stories of Bernard Malamud, you get a sense of what the picture of those kinds of lives were like, of running grocery stores and little businesses. And that was what most New York Jews were doing in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. Some of them were in the factories and the garment industry, but increasingly they were in these small businesses. So that's a story that just has not been explored in the literature. And part of the reason is that small business people don't like having records, having their lives documented in records, because, you never know what agency of the government is going to see how much, as much of the business as they could do in cash, they tried to do. So you won't find at the famous research libraries, the Library of Congress or the 42nd Street Library, you won't find the financial papers of small businesses like my dad's business. As I wrote this, I began to see, it's almost as if I were a novelist, the arc of their lives, how their childhood. My mother had been born in the middle of World War I in a battlefield, really, in eastern Poland, northeastern Poland, the German army coming through, the Russian army trying to be defending it, and so on. Every group, Lithuanians had an army, the Austrians had an army, the White Russians and Red Russians. The only people who didn't have an army were the Jews. And how that had shaped her life, and this terrible story about my grandfather's being taken captive by the Cossacks, by the Red Army, and driven deep into Russia, and how he had escaped, and that provoked his decision to get out of Poland and come to New York in 1922, and how this family, the other elements of this the story of their lives, could be told. The crisis of the 1960s, when they were well settled in a neighborhood in Brooklyn, with lots of friends around, peers, and suddenly through shenanigans and business scandals and government scandals, they lost their house to this kind of block-busting scheme, and some of it had good intentions. Some of it was just plain theft, and the government lost what would now be more than $2 billion in this theft, and they were forced then to become vagabonds again, and that was a terrible and difficult time. So this arc of this life, the shape of this life, began to interest me, and I began to really see that there was a kind of drama to this story that I think deserved, and all lives. I think there's much greater, we tend to now, if you go to bookstores and you look for biographies and memoirs, there are a lot of Holocaust survival stories. They're very important. There are a lot of stories now of recovery from addiction and all kinds of crises and trauma of one kind or another. I don't have that kind of story to tell here, but I have a story that I think that has a tremendous drama to it. And I want you to sort of think about the way in which the lives of the people you care about also has a kind of dramatic arc to it. So it's a new kind of history in a sense. And I had great pleasure in writing it, and I've had great, interesting conversations with readers. Some of it about my family, but a lot of it about, obviously, about their own family. So I would love to stop. Some of you I know have read the book, some of you have not. I hope you will, but all of you may. Everybody in this room, in this Zoom room, has family and questions about family. So maybe we could have a conversation for the rest of this hour.
Thank you. Really, thank you. I'm going to share a couple of thoughts and then a couple questions. And I know that there are some questions out there. And I will say, I just, you know, in thinking about this and reflecting as I was reading, and then certainly even as I signed on today, you know, we all think about our own families and those objects. And when we had our Zoom last week, I had seen it when I read the book, but you held up that bottle opener, and I told you my parents have a very similar bottle opener that I grew up with. It's one of those items that has made the move with them to various places, and also thinking about how we connect differently within our own families. And you talked about in the book, you talked about your experience and your sister Beverly's experiences being somewhat different in the relationships with family. I have my cousin is on here as well. And I know that we have been spending a lot of time this year reflecting on family and those objects that help us connect to one another and sharing those with one another and sharing the stories that go along with them. So I'm really grateful because I find that, at some point we're left with those objects and those letters, if there are letters, and those pictures and things that remind us. And I'm going to share a couple in just a moment, but I'm curious, as you also have done some of this professionally, but I'm sure it's so different. And this is one of the questions I was thinking about as I was reading, knowing that you've done this work with museums around the country, and there's certainly a certain amount of what goes in and what stays in storage, and how do you decide what to highlight and what not to highlight? And I'm sure as you were going through and reflecting on your relationship with your mother, but also the items that you have that emotional connection or attachment to as well, because they tell part of your story. How do you decide what to bring in and what to leave out? And I was thinking about this. So when you read the book, you'll see, if you haven't already, that that each chapter has a connection to an object, and there's a picture of an object or a sketch of an object, which also brought me back to, we all remember those aluminum lawn chairs. Some of us don't just remember them, we may still have them, that remind us of different moments in different places. So how do you decide, and how did you decide, particularly for this book? And is there another book with the stuff that didn't make it into this one?
That's a great question. In the museum world, there's a bias, of course, toward objects that belong to elites and to people of, so, a friend of mine was the curator of collections at the Minnesota Historical Society. He said if he came into his collection, you'd say that all the men in Minnesota wore khaki and all the women wore white lace, because the collection is filled with military uniforms and wedding gowns. And it's very hard to find a worker's apron. So in many of the exhibitions that we did, I had to go and dig up objects that were not in the collection, just find them. Sometimes, on eBay now, eBay is a great thing because you can actually, if you're dealing with objects in the last 150 years, it's often possible to locate things that are not in a collection. Of course, they don't often have stories attached to them, so that's another issue. But so you try to find objects. The objects also in this book are interesting to me. I didn't realize it till after I'd done. They're in a sense, they're not objects that are precious. They're not heirlooms. And that was interesting because I think heirlooms have a certain kind of story attached to them. My mother had, of course, candlesticks she lit. She bench lit every Friday night, but those were not so interesting to me. The lawn chairs, the beach chairs are interesting, partly because they were created by a Brooklyn guy who made them in a factory. They're a product of a new technology of plastic and aluminum tubing that came out of World War II. So as a historian, I was interested in this, but also I thought, my parents now had a car. They no longer packed up a old satchel full of tuna fish sandwiches and went to Prospect Park with a blanket and sat down in the park alongside other families. Now they would put the chairs in the trunk and drive out to Long Island on the new highways that Robert Moses had developed. So it was part of a change in America, and that interested me as a historian. These objects are not necessarily, they're not Jewish objects. That I think is surprising to some people. They're all objects about how their lives got integrated into this American society. And they're not precious objects. So the idea of ordinary life, the idea that, my mother's organization of everyday life was so precise. She was so good, good. And watching her, the wonderful, the universal meat grinder, and watching her put the liver and the onions and the carrots in and turning that in, just as a child. We didn't have preschool in my day, so I was home for the first 5 years of my life every day, and that's what I did. I watched my mother make chopped liver and make cookies, and I always got the carrot sticks and celery sticks from her. So there was a certain way in which this skill, and I think we always underestimate the skill of people like Sarah Rabinowitz. I think women's history is very important to me. I've lived through a generation which my women colleagues have done great work to open up this field. A lot of it is about how women are doing things that were closed, the glass ceiling and all that. But there's also just an enormous amount of skill in keeping a family together, of organizing it. Nothing ever spoiled in Sarah Rabinowitz's kitchen. She had a sense. I loved watching her. I say when she came to Brooklyn to visit, she would do a scouting trip of all the local stores in our neighborhood. And she would come home and say, the bumblebee tuna is 20 cents more at Key Food. And, she knew it before she opened her purse. She knew exactly what the lay of the land was and how she would make that, what she would make on Tuesday that she would then use it as a Vorspeise on Tuesday and main course on Wednesday, and turn it into something else on Thursday afternoon, and all of that kind of stuff. It was great, and I realized there was a kind of intelligence at work there that needed to be really respected. And we're coming, I mentioned this to you, Rabbi, last week. We're coming to this moment the best moment of the year, I think, for me as a Jew, which is the Seder. And there's a great story in the Seder, the story of the Exodus, but there's another story in the Seder, which is this family gathering and friends gathering, and the tremendous sense of skill that's represented in the kind of, we don't give it enough credit. In the Haggadah, we have these 4 words that say, the meal is served. And we all desperately wait for that, because that's usually, the best part of I shouldn't say it, somebody accused me of heresy, but I think it's such an important thing, because it's actually, and of course it's deeply rooted in the history of Pesach and how it became a festival in ancient times. But I love the conversation that goes on. How did you make this? How much was the brisket, this year? Other people in other places in the United States worry about the price of gas. In Brooklyn, it's always, how much is a pound of kosher brisket? What's the price? That's what really people are. That's the index of inflation that's most important. So I want to bring more attention to the daily work of household work, and to the family, and also the psychological. I mean, my mother was not trained. She didn't go to high school, but she managed this family and all of its complexity. And she really, that to me was a remarkable thing. My father was needed a lot of care and tending to become a mensch, and she did wonders. Anyway, so.
When you talked about these sort of ordinary household objects, we had a conversation about that, and I'm sure you could do this with anyone else here as well. But I shared with you, and I have props. I shared I talked about an object that has meaning to me, that is one of those sort of household objects that no one's going to write about it. It's not, it's sacred to me because it's a piece of a connection to my childhood. But the way you took it and sort of talked about the intention behind it was really brilliant, which I'll share. So I grew up with this in the refrigerator. Some of you may know this and recognize this handy holder. It was for a carton of milk or juice. And I grew up with this in the refrigerator when my parents moved, their most recent move, which was we were nearby, so they held on to this because my kids and my sister's kids would use this in their refrigerator, and now we have it in our refrigerator. Now my kids are older now, so they don't really need this, but you talked about the fact that this was a tool for independence, and and how it probably was so helpful. And my mom's an educator. She's, as some of you know, an early childhood educator. And I don't know if this was just a gadget at the time that was advertised, or if it, the intention. I haven't asked her, and I thought she was going to be on here, so I will ask her. But we have this really emotional connection to this, and so it's in my refrigerator now. And my sister comes over with my nephew, who's 5, and he can reach in and pour the milk himself.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and of course, it gets to the whole question of our attitude toward children, and the importance of developing independence, and the idea of refrigerated foods, and the idea of the marketing of that, and all of those things are built into that. And of course, the technology of plastics and all of that kind of stuff that had to be developed for that. But it also becomes that sense of, we all remember the first time the child does that and goes to the refrigerator and does that. We remember that with such a sweetness about it. And it's those moments of sweetness that I think really are foundational in creating a sense of how our families have developed over time. I mean, I think if you start looking for objects like that, the first time that they could go and do something on their own, or do an errand on their own, it's an important step. And I think we never thought that early childhood educators would study those kinds of objects, but they really learned how to use those things. It's great. It's wonderful.
And similarly, it's interesting also, we have an object that was my grandmother's, but that my cousin Deborah and I grew up with on our Seder table every year, which is this picture that, I don't know that there's much value to it. I actually don't know that it's still good to use. In terms of the inside and the line, if it needs to be whatever it is, you'll know. But if it needs to be not plastered, I don't know what the correct word is for a picture, but I have this association with Seder. This was where the grape juice for the kids' table was in this picture, and we still use it. Today it's that same sort of connection. And in thinking about it after our conversation, I thought, oh, that makes sense too. It wasn't just the convenience of having it on the table, but it was accessible and made it possible for us as kids to fully participate and feel adult and grown up. even at the kids' table.
Right, right.
There's a question that somebody sent me in the chat. Lauren Vanderveen said her mother-in-law handwrote almost daily letters to her mother for 20 to 30 years. She has boxes of those letters. They are a treasure and precious innocent memory of the life of a Michigan daughter, wife, mother of 3 sons, and friend from the 1930s through 1950s. Can you recommend a direction Lauren can go in preserving and documenting these letters? And she also said her mother had the same meat grinder and she has the same memory of making chopped liver.
Well, I think the letters are, I mean, what we all need to do is find somebody in the next generation who will care about this as much as we do. I think that's an obligation, a task, because ultimately it's most meaningful within the context of the family. So then there's a question. I mean, of course, you can digitize the letters and put them on a disk, and that will help preserve them. Although, you know, paper lasts a very long time in many, I don't, you know, obviously there's some degradation, but there's always going to be a problem with the digitization anyway, because you have to have the device. You know, you can digitize something and you can have it on a flash drive, but then you have to make sure that there's somebody around who knows how to do something with that flash drive, whereas we assume that somebody will always know how to pick up a piece of paper and read it. I think the most important thing is to go through slowly and to annotate the things you know that are interesting in this, that you can provide as context if you really do want to provide story, you know, because you have stories about this, that it reminds you of. I just got somebody in Oakland read my book and wrote to me and found a diary, it said diary on the back of a grocery store. Their great-grandfather, his 4 cousins, found the great-grandfather's diary. Turns out this man took every opportunity to leave his customers alone in the front of the South St. Paul grocery store. And he went in the back room and started writing, wrote poems, wrote novels, and he wrote something he called a diary, which is actually a kind of family history. And the 4 cousins have now tried to, they've photographed it, but they've also put it on a disc. And the 4 of them have written marginal notes in relationship to what they think that the grandfather. It turns out that he used his diary mostly to explain how angry he was at different members of the family. It was not exactly a sweet, loving great-grandfather. So what's interesting is that the 4 of them have engaged in a conversation and recorded their thoughts, and they're all 4 very different. One of them, in fact, is an Episcopalian and, you know, has no relationship to this Jewish side of the history. One of them is a women's studies person in San Diego. So they've created a kind of conversation about their great-grandfather's document, and I think that's really enormously interesting. And I mean, I read many pages of this. They want to go back and make an exhibition about that. That, I think, is another task. That's complicated, but at least they've got this thing. So trying to find a way to create a context and something to pass it along to children, grandchildren, cousins. You know, in the course of this project of mine, I really brought all of my cousins together to share their stories, and that turned out. And of course, my sister, she lives in California. I don't see her nearly as often as I'd like. We've been separated by a continent for 30, 40 years. But this project, we were on the phone with each other every day for 3 years, and it was a wonderful thing. She's, you know, she's just she just loved it. She thrilled. And she has a kind of amazing memory. She can look at one of those photographs and say, you know, that was a dress. It was made a pinafore, and we bought it at such and such a place at $3.25. And we wore it to Radio City to see National Velvet with Elizabeth Taylor, and she just can just has this amazing memory. So I was really lucky to have a guide like that.
That's
So
wonderful.
that's what I would do with if I, if I had that kind of precious archive. Making it into a book, making it into an exhibition is a huge undertaking, and that's another life, I think. Are there other?
Thank you. Thank you. That's very, very helpful. And I know there's a lot of that digitizing going on as I mentioned, I certainly know that's been a labor of love for my cousin Depres has been doing some of that, and I have boxes of papers that belonged to my grandfather and his sermons and other items from over the years. And the American Jewish Archives will take some of that, but it's also a question of getting that all to them.
One thing that might be helpful that's interesting is that if you have really important documents and they look like the paper is yellowing and cracking, then copying it onto acid-free paper is very, very important. And then you can really have a stable long-term preservation. So typically when we do a project, we take some of the most important documents and we, because they're usually produced on computer, on paper we use in the computer, and that tends to have a 20-year lifetime. So you can buy and copy onto acid-free paper, and then it'll be archival quality. So that's important.
Thank you. That's a wonderful tip. I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. I know some are putting them in the chat. We have a question about what about laminating?
Well, laminating, I don't know how stable it is in the long term. Plastics deteriorate. All of these things have their downside, and we've learned over the years that, as I said before, you have a computer program, but who has an MS-DOS operating system to be able to read that material? So there's no perfect solution yet to this. The most important thing is finding the next human link to the document,
right?
So passing that along. That's the most important.
I actually, some of you may have experienced this too, but when my kids were younger, when they were in elementary school, they often had projects where they had to produce a letter, something to be able to, demonstrate from a couple hundred years ago. And I remember these late night projects where they were making tea and tea bags and all kinds of things. I see lots of nodding on there. So we've all been through that.
Right. And
now we're talking about trying to maintain and preserve these documents for the future. It's thinking about whether the next generation, I guess this is a question I have for you as well, thinking about how what they will need to preserve, because so much of what they create and so much of what is created now is already preserved online,
right?
And is not, we can't necessarily touch it and feel it. Are there objects that you hope your grandchildren will hold on to and keep and preserve?
Boy, that's an interesting question. There are, my grandchildren happen to be living in Norway. That's another story. I sense that my investment is in this. I don't want to be sentimental, but it's in the Jewish people as a collectivity. That for me, the most powerful message is that I just hope that there are Jews 100 years from now who are saying the prayers in whatever way they say them, in whatever worship service. I hope that there's somebody around who understands Brooklyn humor, comedians who the cultural contribution. So for me, I think it's not so much in the family as it is in the peoplehood itself. And that's something I took from my mother. I think I just have a very strong feeling that we have a collective memory. That's what's kept us going for 2,500 or maybe 3,500 years. And it's not going to be, I am just as much the legatee of your father's work. And so I feel like I have to take, and I hope your children can learn from this book. And, I think that's something we share with each other. I think when I say at the end of the book, when we came out of COVID, for the first moment when we gathered together and we said a Shehecheyanu, I think we just felt like we were just becoming, reasserting a kind of mutual responsibility, because we've been so isolated for so long during the pandemic. And so I guess I haven't articulated that before necessarily, but I think that's what I would find. That's why institutions are important. As a young radical in the 1960s, I was always tearing down institutions and hoping to create. But in New York, the YIVO Institute, and at the Center for Jewish History, the Jewish museums, the Jewish heritage sites, the archives of institutions, the American Jewish Archive. These are enormously important. We all will find these connections, and we hope that that's the way. So anyway, that's my push. I think we're not such aristocrats. We have to pass down our stuff within particular families. I tend to sort of see that we're all collected. I love the idea every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that I don't know if I immerse myself so much in the prayers. I just love the idea that my great grandfather read something like this in some place like this, and that I just hope somebody's here 150 years from now to do that again. And that really makes me feel, so my own life is not at the end of this story, and it's not the purpose that I'm here. That a lot of people have always thought about that. And, at this stage in my life, I just feel that legacies passing along are very important. And that's writing this book. Not everybody has this kind of skill, and the investment that other people put into me to give me these skills and to allow me to do this and to use my talents. And the purpose is to leave something behind that other people can make use of, didn't necessarily have this kind of opportunity. I'm the same person, DNA, as my grandfather, who was not, neither of my grandfathers were very literate. So I feel like, I had the opportunities that they didn't have, and I have the obligations and capacities. So that's what that's my sermon for the morning.
So there's a wonderful question, and then I'll see if anyone else wants to unmute and ask. But Susan Stein asked, in a world of extreme decluttering advice, how do we ever get rid of things? Most objects in my home from my parents are a part of my identity. Our children are more careful about acquiring things they can't store. What's the test on what to let go of, if there is one?
I think it's the story that can be attached to the thing. An object, there's a very strange irony to these objects. Every one of the 11 objects in my book has an upside, a positive side, and a downside. My father bought a bottle of perfume for my mother in 1933, the first present he ever gave. It was a wonderful gesture. It's a mystery as to how a boy on the Lower East Side would even know how to buy a bottle of French perfume. But he never asked her what kind of perfume she liked. And that was typical of their relationship. He bought things for her. He indulged himself in his generosity. So that told me something about their relationship. And she would smile and thank him very much. But, she didn't wear that perfume. She wore some other perfume that she bought for herself. So objects, maybe this is just something we always keep in mind. An object, bought a Magnavox stereo TV in 1960. And the result was that I only wanted to listen to music and my father wanted to watch Gunsmoke. And I was trying to, so it's fascinating that objects always have another, at least the objects, nothing is unqualifiedly celebratory. Everything has another side to it. That's at least my temperament to look at those kinds of stories. My sister gave my father a beautiful French clock to put on the wall, and the next thing she knew, he had taken out the works, the Gemara and the Gedorim inside and the guts. And so there's a fascinating quality. And we know objects own us as much as we own them. Get the story recorded, tell the story to your grandchildren, have a sense of irony about it, and be prepared to have these objects just go into somebody else's stories. I have a table downstairs that's 250 years old, and it's filled with the oils. It's covered with oils of all kinds of people who've used it for many, many years, and the people who made it with such care. And it's 28 inches wide, and it's one board. Okay, so trees in the 18th century were that big. You could not find a board that wide anywhere now. So it's an artifact of a different, or it's an object from a world that has disappeared, climate change and lumbering and destruction of our forests. So I love things like that teach me along. Somebody, I hope, 100 years from now will take care of that, but it won't be me. Anyway.
Thank you.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think I'd like to put you on speed dial as we're going through and trying to decide what to keep and what to let go of, and how to tell the story. And it sounds like you're potentially working on some new stories or additional stories.
Well, I'm trying to understand. I'm interested in women's, as I said, in women's history. I'm interested in how women actually made breaks in the domestic sphere in their lives. So I've been going through diaries and memoirs of women who this great story of a woman whose father forbade her to go to gymnasium in Galicia in about 1910, 1920. And her father went off to America, and the next week she enrolled in the gymnasium. And her sister said to her, "But Papa told you that you can't go to gymnasium." And she said, "He's gone." So so she was able to go. So I love those kinds of stories of how women took their lives in their own hands when they could.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing and sharing some of those stories as well. We want to thank you again. I'm going to put in the chat again the link for to purchase the book, Objects of Love and Regret. And you know what, I'll do that while Ruth starts talking, but we encourage you to
we need you to buy the book. We need you to buy the book.
And we look
it's a great present for Pesach. It's a great present for Hanukkah,
or for Mother's Day or
Mother's Day. Right.
And we look forward to continuing to tell our stories collectively. So thank you so much.